Welcome to episode 100.
114, yes.
114. You made a face like I
Sorry, did not mean to make a face.
And Happy New Year, I believe.
Happy New Year, Dome.
Yeah. So I thought today would be great for us to talk about science.
Science, such a loaded topic. It's a good one, though.
Yeah. Obviously, we are huge fans of sports science. We are involved with Deakin University in creating sports science.
Yeah.
We lean on sports science for the foundation of everything we do. So it's massively critical and it's wonderful. But it also it pays. I think if you want to use science in general and sports science in particular, if you want to use it well, you need to know it well and you need to know the strengths and weaknesses. Just like if I'm using a band saw, and I know it has certain strengths in the workshop. If I'm using a sander, you want to know all the different things. You don't want to be ignorant of those things because you can
because science,
go badly.
Science and the scientific method are incredible tools, and they are the best we've got. But that doesn't mean they're perfect.
No,
there are still flaws, strengths, weaknesses, things that different things lean well into and others don't. I think it's worth being aware of and cognizant of these.
And we chatted a while ago, we did that episode about the ridiculous ice bar, the sensationalist journalism about that ice bar thing.
Yeah.
Go back and check that out after you listen to it. If you like this one, you'll like that one.
We'll link that one. We talked about, there was an article that said, ice baths are terrible, they're a waste of time, stop doing it. But if you actually read the scientific article that they reference, the article finishes saying, yeah, they might be helpful, don't rush, but they're okay. And so this article just completely
misconstrued it. Yeah.
And just messed things up.
And that's because the media, newspapers, articles, things do not sell well when they go, nothing confirmed. It seems we're not quite sure, but there may be something in this.
But the researchers tried really hard. It's not going to go very well.
They want to be able to shout things. They want to be able to have clickbait.
Like every second month you'll hear chocolate is good for diabetes or red wine reduces risk of this.
People want to read that. Yeah. So I think what can happen often is that this is a particular thing that can happen to young sports science grads where they can be kind of like, if science hasn't proven it, that thing does not exist.
Therefore, ignore it and never do it ever.
And the analogy, the metaphor I really like is that if you imagine the totality of everything you could ever know as a big wall in a room and it's dark, the light's off, it's nighttime, pitch black. And then you have a torch and you shine that torch onto a section and that is now 30 centimeter size piece of light. That's probably science. That's the part of existence that has had the light shone on it. We know that's there. That doesn't mean the rest of the wall doesn't exist. It just means we've only seen that part.
Yeah.
And that's so critical. And I get arguments with physios. I don't know, it seems more lately to me that physios are really going hard on the evidence-based or bust. Like it's got to be evidence-based. So they'll I had one example of a friend of mine was told that she was not allowed to refer to trigger points in the practice because trigger points had not been proven on an evidence basis.
Yeah, there's been some debate recently about whether they actually are in fact trigger points and what they are and what's in them and things like that.
And it's like, but you've got those points that really hurt and then the elbow goes into them and then they stop hurting.
Yeah, there's tight tissue, whether we can call it a trigger point or not, it's something that's inhibiting the muscle, and when you release it, the muscle works better.
So I thought we'd go through the full spectrum.
Yeah.
And
talk about types of science.
Let's start with perhaps the gold standard, the double-blind study.
Well,
or do you want to?
Even bigger than that is this. If we should go, you can measure it. Sorry, you can measure it a few different ways as to what you call the gold standard.
It is what's widely regarded as the definitive scientific proof.
Well, a systematic review, they would say, which is where you get all the studies together and you look at see what multiple studies looked at. Would kind of be the big picture.
So a systematic review of double-blind studies.
Yeah, and so a meta-analysis is another name. They're slightly different, but the same kind of idea.
Could we talk about a randomized controlled trial with double-blind first?
Yeah.
And then, because that's what people think of when they think of science.
Yes,
they
good
think
idea.
Test tubes.
Start there, good idea.
So, you have a hypothesis and you want to experiment with it. And so what you do in an ideal world is you have a cohort of people, could be rats, whatever.
Here's the other thing. Most often it is male university students.
Yeah.
Because they're easy to control for and they're easy to get in the university environment.
Yep. And so you want to investigate, does stretching enhance performance, for instance? So what you do is you take a group and you have one group do absolutely nothing different to normal. They're your control group, so they are just living their life, not changing anything.
So you get some baseline tests first, of course.
Sorry.
Get baseline tests.
You work out how high they can all jump, for instance.
Run, fitness, whatever you want to measure. Then you take your control group and you sit them on their bum, and they just do exactly what they normally do for a week.
Yep.
The other group, you say, I want you to do this stretching routine every day for 7 days, and we'll see you in a week.
And to be fancy, you might have a third group that does a different stretching routine.
Yeah, maybe they do dynamic stretching, or they do visualization. Maybe is a cool one that's being worked on a lot at the moment. And
then you compare, and then you can see, okay, who got a result, who didn't, why, and so forth. And so that, that's a great way to work out what's going on. Mm-hmm. But not everything lends itself. There's so many things that just don't lend themselves well to randomized control. And because for an RCT to work really well,
RCT is randomized control trial.
You need to be able to control those variables really tightly. So if someone's doing something a bit differently, if they're doing the stretch a bit differently, if they're doing their jumping a bit differently, there's all these other things. You need to get all the variables out. So you need to strip it back to what can we deliver that has the highest reliability. And often that forces you to move away, I think, from validity. Yeah. Because it becomes less and less, the more controlled you make it, the less real world it is. And so you have to do that.
Yes, and in science you have this trade-off between validity, which means how valid is that, back in the stretching example, how valid is that back to athletes training in the real world, playing sport, going to the gym, things like that. Whereas reliables, can we repeat this study again and again and again by controlling all these things and stripping it back to its bare minimum?
And then the secret bias, the unspoken bias in all of sports science and all of science in general, is that the worst thing you can do is design a study that with inadequately amplified inputs. So you end up with this kind of nil-nil draw.
Yeah.
Like you spend maybe 6 months, you're getting your ethical approval, you're doing this stuff, you're doing all this stuff.
Get your subjects, and they cost money. And
then it comes back, results are inconclusive. So the pressure that creates is that most science, particularly sports science, I guess that's what I see more of. But it's you can see that the design of the study is such that it's guaranteeing a result by having extreme input. So for stretching, if you read the stretching literature, it's hilarious. Some of it's like, we had the subject stretch the gastrocnemius muscle for 1 hour, then tested power. Well,
so many of them, they'll do like this full 15-minute stretching routine, and then immediately after
afterwards,
like they'll go straight from last stretch into a vertical leap test.
Yeah,
which is just something you never see in real sport.
No, and then people will say, "Oh, science has shown you shouldn't bother static stretching." Then a whole generation of players has worse mobility, worse recovery, because of that. So that extreme input of guaranteeing yourself a result by designing the study to avoid a nil-nil draw, I think that's a really important thing. So that move away from validity into reliability, that's just an unfortunate impact of RCTs. Where it works differently is if you're doing medication, it works so much better because you can control the dose of the medication, and you can just go, these people were given this dose, these people were given this dose, and it lends itself beautifully to that because there's no dilution of validity in the pursuit of reliability.
And you also do those studies on an enormous scale. So once a drug company has got to that level, if they've got their drug to the point where you can now safely give it to humans without some crazy side effect or death or anything like that, if you've got to that point, you've now got the budget where you can give it to 10,000 people per group, and so you can then see over 6 months how it works.
So that double-blind study is amazing if you can do it while retaining still some validity. It's great. But the other problem too in that is that if the people know there is a strong impact, and this is becoming more and more scientifically validated, that when we believe a certain thing about a modality, it will create some of that modality coming into effect. So if you believe that this pill is going to make you smarter, your IQ will go up after you've taken that pill. Like that self-belief, that placebo effect.
They will give people sugar pills. Is usually so. One group gets a sugar pill, the other group, and they tell them, so this is for depression, this is for your blood sugar control, this is for your exam focus, and both groups will improve. And so it wasn't the fact that the active ingredient was in the pill; it was the fact that we told them this is the magic pill.
And so that kind of means that,
and that's called placebo.
Yeah. And so that's an interesting element to it as well. So.
One thing before we move on, one thing that RCTs, randomized controlled trials, don't work well for is nutrition.
Yeah.
Nutrition and anything that requires a length of time. So anything that requires the participants to be active. So, for example, a stretching study is you couldn't give a group of athletes the same stretches for 6 months and expect them to do it every day without supervision. And the supervision is expensive because you need to bring them in every day. And so nutrition, things like, hey, come in, we'll educate you, we'll teach you all these things, and we'll send you on your way. The chances of those people continuing with the paleo diet or eating this for a certain thing for breakfast to see the effect that has on their health, it's so hard to control that and maintain that consistently because it gets really expensive to have them come in.
Nutrition is such a mess with that stuff. It's so hard. And so they end up resorting on what I think is brilliant, but also in some ways the worst thing, which is the retrospective study of we'll study 10,000 people, and it turns out that the people who eat lots of red meat are also getting heaps and heaps of colon cancer. Therefore, red meat causes colon cancer. Whereas it's actually that those red meat people were the non-exercise, only eat chips,
more likely to smoke,
and all these other things that were confounding. If you actually separate out and look at the people eating healthy food, it's not the same. So that's a really common flaw.
And so there's two concepts at play there. One is the idea of a confounding variable, where the people more likely to eat more red meat were also more likely to drink alcohol, for example, is one example. But also you have, so that's a confounding variable, but then you also have, gone blank. So you've got a confounding variable, but then you've also got, I've forgotten.
Oh, no.
It's left me.
Mark it down, people.
I forgot a thing. Episode 114 and I forgot something.
We'll come back to it, and if Jacob doesn't remember before the end of the show, because this is important.
I'll bounce back in my brain any second now. Now the stress has got me forgetting it even more.
Was it the causation correlation?
Thank you. Yes. So,
okay.
So you've got confounding variables are where you do a study looking at red meats, but it happens that red meat eaters also do a certain thing that is actually the causative factor.
Yeah.
The other side of it is, correlation causation. So maybe it's just that, people who do a certain thing are correlated with maybe better attention to detail. Maybe they're more likely to work a certain job which is safer, or work a certain job which pays differently, or something like that.
And the classic is the ice cream sales and shark attacks.
Yeah.
So every summer, shark attacks go up because people are swimming in the water.
There's a greater number of humans in oceans.
In oceans, which is the shark's playground. Jacob, if you don't know, Jacob is a huge shark fan, by the way.
Massive shark fan.
Loves them.
From a distance. I am from a distance.
And the other thing that goes up every summer is ice cream sales. Now, you could incorrectly see that correlation and go, eating ice cream causes you to emit a pheromonone that makes sharks want to eat you.
Or just simply sharks like ice cream. They smell it in the water, they come out of the chicane.
And of course it's not. It's just those two things. And there's a great website which links.
I'll link it. My favorite, though,
is the pirate one?
Yeah. Global warming is increasing at the same rate that pirates are disappearing. So there's an argument that says pirates were what were keeping the world cool.
and so that always, when I'm looking at any study, when I'm looking at pretty much anything, any point someone's trying to make, it's yes, but is that causative? Are we confident? Can we infer that that's a causal factor, or is that just a correlation that happens to be?
Sometimes it's just the same time. The school term starts. It's not because the weather's getting cooler. It's because the school term started, or vice versa.
And some things I think are causative. Like, for instance, there's a great study that showed that if you're a male executive and you're above 6 foot tall, you were X amount of time. You had on average a $10,000 salary higher than a shorter person.
All right, so tall males
made
more in executive jobs.
Yeah, wow. Because they appear more commanding.
Yeah, right.
And that's one where you go, you know what, that kind of stacks up to me. That makes sense. But some of them are just rubbish. And I think that ties in, if you're going to be interpreting that stuff, I think it ties into the lowest rung of scientific evidence, which understandably and sort of correctly, but also incorrectly, so it's a bit of a nuanced contradiction.
Yeah, because that actually nuance is an important thing we should bring up at this juncture.
Yep.
Nuance is so important in sports science, in nutrition science, in pharmaceuticals, in human life in general. And so science's job is to narrow down and pick one thing, red meat.
Before I forget, can we link to the Tim Minchin thing where he talks about nuance? It's awesome. His graduation thing.
Yeah. I'll leave that. It's at the Uni of WA. I think.
Yeah. So good. So worth a watch for life.
Yeah, and so there's so much nuance in life, but science's job is to pick out one thing, stretching, red meat, this pill, and go, does that have the effect we want? That's science's job, and that's how it's kind of been enforced to do. Its job is to find those and answer those questions. But the problem is, if you take those things into isolation, their effect changes. So, for example, static stretching, if you just static stretch before you perform, that's a bad idea. But if you do static stretching as part of a holistic and complete warm-up 2.0, link on our website, then the chronic and the acute effects are profound.
Because the non-nuanced interpretation of the static stretching thing is that static stretching is terrible. It puts your muscles into a coma because they took them straight from the static stretch, bang, into playing. Whereas static stretching is just a nap.
Yeah, which
you can wake those muscles right back up
in seconds. And the key with it is doing the right stretches.
You're not going to do them all. Never going to stretch calves
or rec fem. You're going to leave those guys alone.
Those are our springs. But I'm going to loosen off the handbrakes.
And a callback from last week, we're going to loosen off adductor magnus because it tends to take a fair bit of loads, and we're going to loosen that guy off.
Yeah, and then it'll wake right back up, and it'll be all good.
Yeah, and so that nuance is lost in science's chasing of validity.
Yeah, and so what that means is that anecdotal and expert opinions are often lowly regarded.
They're considered the lowest rung is your expert opinion.
It's interesting. Arguably, one of the greatest sports, not arguably, it's inarguable that Dr. Darren Burgess is one of the greatest sports scientists ever produced in the world and in this country.
Yeah, he's a top 10 of all time guy. Yeah.
He's amazing. And what's his saying? We should be practice-based evidence as opposed to evidence-based practice.
So typical, and we mentioned before with the physios, typical is evidence-based practice. Your practice must be based on evidence. So evidence-based practice.
You don't do it if there isn't a scientific study.
But it's actually the opposite. You should be practicing things and using evidence to steer you towards or away from certain things.
And developing real-world evidence that is actually useful to, I think the other side of that coin is that the practice-based evidence is let's run little experiments and see. Let's get the science
on ourselves first.
Yeah,
and if they work, like callback from last week's episode, which you should definitely check out, talking about adductors, where we ran that experiment. We did the Copenhagen's and the Magnus bridges on ourselves. Looked at our single leg squats. This is working. Applied it to a few athletes. It worked, and then
you're all good.
Took it the whole way out. Yeah.
Yeah, so I know the others. So you've got your systematic review where it's just it's a comprehensive collection of all the stuff.
That brings all the other little studies together and looks at, let's look at squat depth and vertical leap. Do people who squat deeper jump higher? You bring all those studies together and you go, actually...
The weight of evidence says. And so currently the systematic review says that you should not bother worrying about VMO, muscle in your quad, for patellofemoral pain.
And it's all glute-med.
It's all glute-med, so there's no role. And I think, and some people say, well, let's not do any of that work. And a friend of mine, colleague of ours, Mick Hughes, is actually like, no, you should still do glute-med, but you should do some quad work as well. And I couldn't agree more. We'll get him out of here at some point on the podcast. We'll chat about it.
Mick's a great thinker.
Really good thinker. So I think it's important that you don't throw out the baby with the bathwater with that stuff. If it hasn't been proven, that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It just means it hasn't been proven.
Yeah, like that torch hasn't been shone on that part of the light yet.
On that part of the wall. Yeah. And the catalyst for this was, I saw an article this week about, and what it showed was that professional cyclists performed better than amateur cyclists on a grueling cognitive test. And so one way of interpreting that would be going, high intensity, long duration cycling will make you better at going through these cognitive tests. That'll make you smarter. The other one is, if you step back from it and go causation and correlation, the kind of people, the kind of like relentless people that become professional cyclists.
Professional cycling is not a walk in the
It's
park.
not
That is
for the
not
faint-hearted.
that is not a just I'll dabble in that.
You have a hunger for pain and competition and finishing a thing.
Yeah, they are can-do people.
So, of course, the professional guys are going to be awesome. It could well be that professional cycling makes you 20% dumber, and those guys would still do better.
Because of their stick-to-itiveness and their grit.
Yeah. So I think that's what got me thinking about it. And so if you can have that critical idea of look at the studies, be guided by the science, but also recognize where maybe science is not quite there yet. I mean, if we had waited for science to catch up with what we knew about supramaximal isometric load for tendons. Think of all the athletes that we wouldn't have.
Well, not even super maximal.
Even just
low level isometric.
Low, just the magic of isometrics in general. Because there was a time where I was getting into so many arguments about how there was a fashion for a while that people would go around saying you should do heaps of eccentric work for Achilles.
Not so much a fashion. That was what the science was saying at the time.
Well, the thing is, it wasn't really, because people were saying it all the time. People were saying, Jill Cook says.
That's true. There was a miscommunication.
Jill Cook didn't say. We spoke to her. And whereas now it's everyone's, on board with the isometric stuff.
A lot more isometric and time and attention type loading. It's not about being supramaximally eccentric. It's about being activating and priming and getting those tendons responding. But
what was interesting to me was that if you took a step back, if you slowed down, if you really deeply considered the problem, it doesn't make sense that eccentric only is the answer, because we're operating in a world where we have to be concentric, isometric, and eccentric.
Yeah.
And if you can, why would you only get the eccentric when you could have also got some concentric? So that I think if for calf, I think of concentric is where you're doing the up part of a calf raise. Eccentric is the down part, and isometric is if you're holding, kind of hovering halfway.
Like on your tiptoes.
On tiptoes. So if you take a step back and look at it logically, it's like, I reckon it's probably going to be likely that some concentric is going to be helpful as well. So it's that ability to apply that kind of overlay of experience and logic, and then critically analyze what science has served up so far, but also being cognizant of what science might serve up in 5 years. That way you're not having to do these backflips on stuff when science arrives at where you need it to get to.
Yeah, and so listening to experts, reading the research, reading not just the abstract or the blog article that goes with the research, actually going, that's an interesting insight in the article. Are they on target or not? And then actually clicking further in and going, hang on, these researchers who did this study for 6 months or 12 months or however long it was actually said there's no effect. Why is that blog article saying that? It's a sexy, exciting caption.
Can I tell briefly before we close out the story of what was the catalyst for all of this for me originally?
I'm not sure why you're asking. I think you should just go straight into your story. Right. So I'm always on board for a Durham story.
So it was 12, 15 years ago. And I got into a heated argument with a sports medicine doctor friend of mine, who was relatively fresh out of uni, still as plying his trade. And the argument, we had two arguments, and one of them was, the studies have proven that static stretching is terrible. You shouldn't do it. And I said, really? Show me the studies. And he sent me, and he's very thorough. He sent me 16 studies. And
correlation between being a sports doctor and being very thorough as well, just for those out there.
And I printed out all 16, and I got out my highlighter, and I slowly read them. And that was my epiphany moment about sports science, because I was like, wow, some of these studies are just so low on validity. I just like, whoa, this is so far away from what we do in the real world.
And also a lot of them have small sample sizes. They have single non-homogeneous. Is that the correct term?
Yep.
So they're single, like they're just. We had 10 uni students.
And they're not homogeneous. They're not homogeneous. So homogeneous means the same. So homogenized and pasteurized milk, it's uniform. And so what I was blown away, what I did was I sorted the studies into great, realistic, compelling study, not so compelling, and just had a look at them. I was like, it's actually not, at that point in time, there was no, what I would call definitive real world science answering the question. A couple of years after that, the AIS came out with a great study.
I believe Jeremy Shepherd was one of the authors on that paper too.
Yeah, I think you're right. That actually was the best study I think ever done on whether static stretching has a performance decrement.
Yeah.
And what was interesting is, if you think about it, the job of a researcher in many ways is to do more research, to get more grants, to do more research. There is
to stay on that loop.
There's a bit of a loop. And the KPI for an academic is output of publications. The key performance indicator for an institution like the AIS or the VIS is, are we making athletes better?
Gold medals and world championships.
So we don't care as much about that. We just want to know. We just want stuff that has traction that counts. So they came up with this great study that had, I think it was their netballers, do some stretching, not do stretching.
21 or 19 netballers split across two groups.
Yeah. Yep. And then the one group did stretching and did a dynamic warm-up, and then one group didn't do stretching, did dynamic, and then they did speed over 20 meters. And they found no performance decrement. Yep. So that should have upturned 10 years of research. That should have been front page news. People should be going.
And the conclusion was that static stretching, if followed by dynamic warm-up, has no effect on performance and speed and power.
Yeah.
And that should be like, it changes everything. But
because the other thing my doctor friend said, we know that long-term static stretching helps. So it's proven. Long-term, chronically it helps. Like, right, but isn't long-term made up of a whole series of doing things short-term?
No one's making the MBA by just thinking long-term. They're doing the work.
Yeah, they do the work. And the other classic one was that I was really big on landing stuff, and landing as a means of
like teaching teaching
people to land like ninjas as a means of injury prevention. Because logically, if you eliminate bad landings, you eliminate the major way people hurt themselves coming down from the air. Like that's just I don't need a study to show me that.
Got to learn to land before you can fly.
That's just logic. And early on, he was like, "No, don't talk about. There's no science to prove what you're saying. You don't even talk about that." 3-4 years later, 50 ACLs later, he was like, "Oh yeah, landing's really important." Like, yeah, like it's just that's the experiential and the logical side of things. Yeah. So if as a young S&C coach, if you can get your head early around the fact that there's nuance, and you can look at that stuff
and take everything with a grain of salt.
Yeah,
and apply your own filter to things. And the better your filter can be, and the more skill you can have at, okay, that's an interesting point. I see why that applies to that context. Maybe I've got different athletes. Maybe I've got a slightly different context, or less time, or less equipment, whatever it might be, or more equipment. Then the answer to everything is not always the same. It changes.
Yeah. And so the bang for buck is going to be different. Like we probably get more of a bang for buck. And I feel like this accent turned a bit too much of a stretching thing, but just provides such a good example. We like a lot more than stretching. Like,
we lift heavy weights. We do fast sprints. We jump lots.
Out of a 90-minute workout, 4 minutes of it is stretching.
Yep.
Let's be clear. But it does provide a really good example of that. And we probably get a little bit better bang for buck out of stretching than some other populations, because we've got tall, rapidly growing athletes whose bodies are really tight.
A lot of teenagers.
Yep. So that's gonna change it for us. If we were training a bunch of 25-year-old rugby players, it might be different. But the bang for buck we get is amazing. So you've got to look at what bang for buck are you getting out of that as well,
and your context. Agreed.
Cool. That was a bit dense. Sorry about that, guys.
Time went real fast. I will find. Where do we get a link?
If you could find that AIS study,
the AIS study, I believe it was Jeremy Shepherd one. Yep, with the netballers. We've done an episode on the ice bars one. I think that's a good one to go back. That's more the media side.
If you like this, go back to that. If you don't, apologies.
We've got an episode on stretching, which actually talks individually, wholly and solely about stretching. So we'll link that one as well. Did we mention another one in there? I don't think we did. I think that might be it.
I think it's good. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.
Cool. All right. Cheers. See ya.